Okay, last Sunday, I forget even who it was. Someone asked me a question about the Persian Empire, and they're probably not even here now. I don't remember who it was, but
Jared, I think.
yeah, it might have been Jared. About the Persian Empire. It was after classes over. Asked me something about the Persian Empire, and so consequently, what I have done here is. First of all, pull up a map. This is a map that I've used before. Shows the area of the Assyrian Empire. And of course, the Assyrian Empire at the time was the largest empire to exist up until that point. And well, at the time we were studying, they included this whole area. It's in green. This is the original Assyrian Empire. And then they had also conquered this area, came down this area, all the way down here and into Egypt. Notice this one little area over here that they were not able to conquer. That was Judah and Jerusalem. They were never able to conquer that. But that was the largest empire in the world up until that time. So now we come to the Persian Empire. I don't know if this shows up as good here as I thought it was going to. But anyway, Persia really is not very large. Located down here on the Persian Gulf, it's in the southern part of what is now Iran. And in 550 BC, Persia conquered the Medes. And then they incorporated the Medes into their army. So it made them a pretty powerful army. So then they went up here and conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And they really controlled this whole area over here, all of what had been the Babylonian and before that the Assyrian Empire, and this area up into here and all the way down into here. Now, the one area that they didn't control anymore was Egypt. And that came about a little bit later, 525 BC. Cyrus the Great's son went down and conquered Egypt. So eventually they conquered this whole area, and that made them probably about twice as big as the Assyrian Empire had been. So Syria was the largest at their time, and now the Persian Empire was very large. So they controlled this, and now they also allowed the captives to go back, not only the ones in Judah and Jerusalem, but other areas as well. They allowed them to go back to where they were originally from. And as long as they didn't give them any trouble, why, they were allowed to go home and had pretty much their own rule of government and so on. So anyway, I don't know if that answers the question that was brought up, and since Jared's not even here this morning, well, if he's the one that asked me the question, why, anyway, it settles it in my mind. Okay, last week we talked a little bit about the theme of the book of Zechariah, and broke the book of Zechariah down into two sections. And the first 8 chapters are basically hope and encouragement for those that had come back, that they might go ahead and finish the temple and start on the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And so this part is just to encourage them to keep up and keep going on what they had already started. They had started about 2 months earlier, after Haggai had encouraged them to get started. Now then, beginning in the 7th verse, and we already got started on this last week, but beginning in the 7th verse of chapter 1, going through the 6th verse of or the 8th verse rather of chapter 6, Zechariah had 8 visions. We talked a little bit last week about apocalyptic language and so on. And these visions were mostly in symbols and signs and so on. And so I decided to back up and try to get all 8 of those visions in one class here. We covered the first 2. I think we were starting on the 3rd one last week. I decided to back up and just try to get all 8 of them in one class so we can kind of see the general flow of things through these visions that Zechariah had. Okay, Zechariah's first vision then, he saw horses and riders. Okay, they were identified. And some of these visions that he had, the angel identified to Zechariah what they were. Some of them the angel didn't. So maybe they're pretty self-explanatory. Okay, the first vision, the horses and riders, they represented God's army. And the question was asked, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem? And the answer God's answer was good and comforting words. Okay, God said, I am jealous for Jerusalem and Zion. I'm very displeased with the heathen. They helped. The heathen helped, but they had an evil intent. But then God said, I am returned to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it. So this was encouragement to them that the temple would be completed. A line shall be stretched over Jerusalem. This was just an indication that Jerusalem would be rebuilt. My cities will prosper. The Lord will comfort Zion. And Jerusalem was to be God's chosen city again. So this first vision that Zechariah had was just a message of hope, encouragement to the people that had returned, and it showed them that God was with them. He was concerned about them. His mercy was going to be extended to them, and his blessings would be poured out on them. Okay, the second vision that Zechariah had then were the 4 horns and the 4 craftsmen. Now, as I mentioned last week, whenever horns are mentioned in any kind of apocalyptic language, if I work on it, I can get it out. Apocalyptic language, it usually means someone in power or authority. And in this case, it represents nations that had oppressed God's people, scattered Judah and Jerusalem, and so on. And then the 4 craftsmen represented those who were coming to terrify and bring down the horns. So the horns represented Gentile nations that had oppressed Judah, and they were oppressed to the point where people were even afraid to raise their head. But there was also the craftsmen then that were going to take these horns down. So it represents God's judgment coming on the various people that had oppressed God's people over the years. So again, it was a message of encouragement to God's people that those that had oppressed them were going to be taken down. In fact, if we go clear back to the book of Genesis in chapter 12, God made a promise to Abraham. He said, I will bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you. And you shall all families of the earth be blessed. So this was just God telling the people that he was going to keep his promise that he had made to Abraham, centuries before. Okay, we come then to Zechariah's third vision. A man was with a measuring line. He's measuring Jerusalem. Again, symbolic. Jerusalem was going to be rebuilt, and this was symbolic of that. He says Jerusalem will be inhabited, down in verses 4 and 5. We're in chapter 2 now. And eventually it would be without walls, and God would protect Jerusalem, and God's glory was to be in the midst. So again, encouragement. And then he goes right on in to encourage those that were still in Babylon to return. It says, come forth, flee from the land of the north. And as we mentioned earlier, over 40,000 had returned, but the majority of the people had not returned from Babylon. They had evidently taken the advice that Jeremiah had given them in Jeremiah chapter 29. He told them, you're going into Babylonian captivity, build houses, establish yourself there, stay at peace. If you're at peace, you're going to have peace. Don't cause trouble, in other words. And evidently they took his advice, and so they felt they were better off there than they were coming back to Jerusalem, which was in a state of ruin at that point. And some of them were probably living in comfort. They had security there in Babylon, and especially after the Persians took over. And economically, they were probably better off there than if they had returned to Judah and Jerusalem. But he encourages them, deliver yourself, O Zion. Babylon will be punished. Now, at this point, Babylon was still standing. In fact, the Persians took over Babylon basically without a battle. And but he's telling them that Babylon will be punished. I will shake my hand upon them. They shall be a spoil or plundered. Okay, and then in verses 10 through 13, what I consider anyway to be a messianic prophecy, he said, sing and rejoice. I will come and dwell in the midst. Many nations shall be joined to the Lord. So later on in the book of Zechariah, we have a lot of messianic prophecies. And I think this was probably one too, that many nations were going to be joined to the Lord. Okay, we have then Zechariah's fourth vision. This is chapter 3 of the book of Zechariah now. And we have Zechariah having a vision now of Joshua, the high priest, that had returned from Babylon, and he was being cleansed for service to the Lord. And there was a problem, though. Satan was there. Satan was going to resist this. So Satan is rebuked. And so this is a brand plucked out of fire. So God was not going to let this line of priests be cut off here. He was going to keep the line going. And Joshua here was actually a descendant of Aaron. If you trace back the lineage, he was actually a descendant. We're going to see that a little bit later here. And well, and I'll talk about Zerubbabel at that time also. But this is just symbolic of the high priest being cleansed. And when he first appeared here in Zechariah's vision, he was in filthy clothes. And the high priest was not allowed to come in contact with anything that was unclean. And here he was all dirty. So the filthy clothes were taken from him. He's clothed in clean garments, representing that iniquity was going to be removed. And a clean turban was placed on his head. And his service was now acceptable to God. And then God gives a charge to Joshua in verses 6 and 7. He says, walk in my ways. He says, walk in my ways, keep my charge, then you shall judge my house and keep my courts, and I will give you places to walk among these. So God makes a promise to Joshua that if he walked in God's ways and did everything that he was supposed to, then God would bless him. And then in verses 8 through 10, he says, I will bring forth my servant, the branch, and behold the stone. Again, we have a symbolic number, 7, which indicates perfection or completeness. 7 eyes, all seeing. And I think the key message from this one was that iniquity was going to be removed, and peace and security was going to be granted to the land of Judah from God. And I'm sure that as Zechariah saw this vision, and when he revealed this vision to the people at that time, that they were all encouraged because God was again with Judah. There had been a period of time where God wasn't with them, so he was now with them again. So all these visions now are visions of encouragement for the people. Okay, now we come to Zechariah's 5th vision, and this was Zerubbabel now encouraged and being prepared for his work. Okay, in the 5th vision, we have golden lampstand and 2 olive trees. And God's people, Israel, were referred to as the light of the world. And Zerubbabel was God's servant. And God said that the temple would be completed by Zerubbabel, but not by his might or power, but by my Spirit. So Zerubbabel was the one that was going to do it, but it was through God's Spirit that it was going to be done. He promised that Zerubbabel's hands shall finish the temple. God would remove the mountains or the barriers that stood in the way. They had limited resources to work with, and there were a lot of problems that came up. But God was going to take care of all those, and the temple would be completed. Some people despised the smaller temple. They cried when they even saw the foundation of it. But again, we have a symbolic 7 eyes of the Lord, or the all-seeing eyes of the Lord, complete and perfect knowledge of God and what was going on. So this vision was Zerubbabel and Joshua, God's anointed. Now they're referred to as God's anointed. They are the anointed ones, and they stand by the Lord of the earth. So again, a vision of encouragement for the people that God indeed was going to bless the work of Zerubbabel, and the temple would be finished on his watch. I guess we already covered that one. Okay, going on to Zechariah's 6th vision now, the flying scroll. He saw a scroll that was flying. It was written on both sides. On the one side was the curse for stealing, and on the other side, the curse for swearing falsely or swearing falsely before God. And the house of the thief was to be consumed, and the house of him that swears falsely was also to be consumed. And the scroll represents God's law, going all the way back to the 10 Commandments. And God is bringing judgment on those who disobey his law. So even though it only talks about the stealing and him that swears falsely, it encompasses the whole 10 Commandment law.
An awful big scroll, isn't it?
Well, it was 20 cubits by 10 cubits. So,
Wow.
pretty big, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now we come to the 7th vision of Zechariah, the basket and the woman. Okay, again, angel explains to Zechariah that this is a basket, and this is the iniquity of the people. And the cover made out of lead, a lead cover on this basket. And you can imagine how heavy that would be, a lead cover. So whatever's in there is not going to get out. So the cover was raised, and inside a woman sat in the basket, or in the ephah that's referred to. Woman was referred to as wickedness. This is wickedness. the lead cover was put back on the basket so that the wickedness could not get out of the basket. The woman was sealed inside. This woman, of course, represented wickedness. Two women with wings appeared. They carried the ephod to Shinar, another word for Babylon, where a house was being prepared for it. The side note doesn't say that these two women who appeared with wings and carried it off to Shinar were angels. We kind of, I guess, assume that they were. But if they were, it's the only time in the Bible that angels are referred to in the female gender. You know, we always symbolize angels as being females, but in the Bible, they're always symbolized as being male. And this is the only time, and they're not really identified here as angels, but if they are, it's the only time in the Bible that the angels appeared as females. That's just a side note. I just threw in. Okay, this vision by Zechariah symbolizes the removal of wickedness, and especially idolatry, by God from the land. He sends him into Babylonian captivity for that specific reason, especially the idolatry. And so this symbolizes that through this, God is showing his people that he has forgiven them of their past sin of idolatry. Okay, then we come to Zechariah's 8th vision. That's found in chapter 6, the first 8 verses. We have 4 chariots that came from between 2 mountains. The first chariot is pulled by red horses. Second chariot pulled by black horses. Third chariot by white horses. And the fourth chariot by dappled horses. These are identified as the 4 spirits of heaven. They go forth from the presence of the Lord, and they brought God's judgment on the Gentile nation. Now, if you want to read a little bit more about the symbolism and so on, and the color of the horses and so on, in Revelation chapter 6, you have a very similar language, first 8 verses of Revelation chapter 6. And not only do you have the same color horses, but it also tells you what each one of those colors symbolizes. Okay, when Zechariah saw these 4 chariots come from between the 2 mountains, the horses were straining and they wanted to go. They wanted to do whatever God wanted them to do. However, judgment is in the hands of God, and it's reserved for the right time and the right place. God would determine when that would happen. The message, I think, in this 8th vision was that that God would indeed judge the Gentile nations for all the atrocities that they had committed against his people. but it would happen in God's time. So, everyone wants everything to happen right now. They want people punished right now, but it was going to happen in God's time. Okay, I think it was a message of hope and encouragement because, it really showed that God is in control, not only of Judah and Jerusalem, but of all the nations of the world. And when God determined, then their punishment would come. Okay, that's the 8 visions. I got through them all. Didn't know if I would. That's the 8 visions that Zechariah had here. And anyone have any comments? No questions, just comments. Please. Okay, like I said right in the beginning, these visions were all meant to be encouraging to the people, to have them really get behind the effort of rebuilding the temple. The temple was very important, not only to them, but in future generations. And we're going to see that more as we get into the latter part of the book of Zechariah here, how important the temple was to future generations.
Is there any significance into the order of the horses in this versus the order in Revelation? Because I think in Revelation, the white horse goes first, and then the red, and then the black. I'm just curious if there's
I don't know if there,
any reason why the white horse signifies um, why it would be third unless there was like some sort of destruction that was coming first, and then I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that there are different orders.
I don't know that the order necessarily has anything to do with them. The red horse usually symbolized war or some kind of a major calamity. But then the black was a symbol of famine, and people were going to starve to death because they didn't have anything to eat. The white horse, symbol of death, and then the pale horse or dappled horse was various plagues that were coming on the people. So whether the order had anything to do with it, I have no idea. Okay, anyone else have any comments?
Jim,
Yeah.
I was reading about the horses, and one here in Zechariah was talking about like the location more than the order. I don't know if that helps in any way. Like one went north and then one went.
2 went north, I think. 2 went north and 2 went south.
And the
Yeah.
location had something to do with it rather than the order.
Well, yeah, and you look at the where Judah and Jerusalem is located, there's really nothing to the east or west. Everything is either north or south. So God's judgment was going, in that direction. Okay, any other questions or comments on these visions? Okay, beginning in the 9th verse then of chapter 6, we have, it's not actually a vision. This is actually something that happened. This is a historical event that happened. We had some people come back from Babylon, and they brought with them various silver and gold and so on. So, well, I got one slide here. I might as well cover here. Okay, the visions of Zechariah have now ended. In the visions, God has assured his people that he is displeased with the heathen nations because of the way they treated his people, and he will bring judgment on them. Again, in his time and his place. The temple will be completed by Zerubbabel. God will reestablish his presence in Jerusalem. And if you remember, read the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel in a vision saw God's presence leave the city of Jerusalem. So he was going to reestablish his presence in Jerusalem. He also encouraged the people that their sins had been forgiven and he would protect them in the future. And he also promised to send his servant, the branch, and he would be both a priest and a king. And we're going to see that here a little bit, well, in the crowning of Joshua here. In chapter 6. Okay, we have three visitors that came from Babylon, and beginning in verse 9. And they brought with them silver and gold. And Zechariah was instructed to make a crown of silver and gold and set it upon the head of Joshua, the high priest. Now, what do you think that symbolizes?
So like what I read was it was joining of the royal and priestly roles, so it's probably a foreshadowing of Christ.
Okay, he's looking forward to the time when they would have someone who was both a priest and a king. So Zechariah had already been cleaned up for service as a priest, but now they put a crown on him, symbolizing he was being crowned as a king. As I mentioned before, Zechariah, or Joshua, rather, was a priest. He was of the tribe of Levi. He was a direct descendant of Aaron. Now, Zerubbabel, and we don't have him mentioned here, but Zerubbabel was of the tribe of Judah. He was a descendant of King David. And he was I think, the grandson of King Jehoiachin, who had been taken into Babylonian captivity. So he was actually of the royal family. Now, he wasn't a king. They don't have any more kings. He was appointed by the Persian king to be governor. So he was a ruler, but he wasn't a king. Okay, I think Karen pointed out there, the setting of a crown on his head was symbolic. And beginning in verse 11, I think we kind of see that it was symbolic of the coming Messiah. Says that the branch shall grow from this place. He shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall bear the glory. He shall sit and rule upon his throne. He shall be a priest upon his throne. The counsel of peace shall be between them. The crown to be a memorial in the temple. They that far off shall come and build in the temple. You shall know that the Lord has sent me. Those who diligently obey the Lord will share in the blessings. Okay, so this is, I think, a symbolic act again, signifying the coming of the Messiah later on, who will be both a priest and a king. Okay, that takes us through to the beginning of chapter 7. I guess that's a good place to stop.